We acknowledge the First Peoples and their traditional lands referred to as Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territories, and that the province of Alberta and all the people here are beneficiaries of these peace and friendship treaties. Treaties 6, 7, and 8, along with small areas of Treaties 4 and 10, encompass the traditional territories of numerous Western Canadian First Nations as well as the Métis people. NorQuest College is dedicated to ensuring that the spirit of these treaties is honored and respected. Heeding the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with funding from Alberta Advanced Education, the Rural Roots program is herein responding to the calls for education for reconciliation. Article 62, 2. To post-secondary institutions to educate teachers on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching into classrooms. Article 63, 2. Sharing information and best practices on teaching curriculum related to residential schools and Aboriginal history. Article 63, 3. Building student capacity for intercultural understanding, empathy, and mutual respect. Article 63, 4. Identifying teacher training needs relating to the above. We are grateful to the elders who, with open hearts, willingly shared the knowledge they keep for their peoples. On behalf of English language learners throughout the province of Alberta, we thank them for introducing newcomers among us to truth about identity, treaty, protocol and ceremony, residential schools, challenges to overcome, and guiding lights.
Well, it started in 1870s, when they wanted to deal with they call it the Indian problem. They wanted to assimilate Indigenous people. Initially, what it started off was, it was a kind of an industrial school where they taught them how to farm, how to raise cattle. They turned it into a boarding school. So when it became a boarding school, the kids have to go there, no choice. And in that reservation, a lot of poverty. And we used to get food rations once a month, maybe some sugar, salt, flour, things like that. And then the children's allowance came. I mean, $7 a child is quite a lot of money back then. You could survive on that. So they used that as a tool to get the kids in school. They were told, if you don't bring your kids to school, you won't be getting your allowance, or you're going to cut your allowance in half, or your ration will be cut in half. So it was a forced assimilation into the boarding school. The whole purpose of these residential schools is to assimilate indigenous people, to forget about their culture, forget about who they are, and adopt to the Western way of civilization. A residential school is a collection of boarding schools, across Canada that the government set up. And they gave the duty to the churches to run them. On my reserve, there's 2 of them. One Catholic and one Protestant. When I was about 7 years old. They usually take them about 5 or 6 years old. But I managed to stay with my parents till I was 7. Picture yourself 5, 6, 7 years old, being battered about by these people, telling me that whoever I am is no good. I'm a product of the devil. So they demonized our culture. They demonized our language. They demonized our ceremonies. They demonized everything Siksika. Those boarding schools are very isolated. Nobody else can go in there except if you're a nun or a priest. When our parents come to visit me, they have to have an appointment. And they can't just come onto the property. And when they do see me, we're not allowed to talk our language. And there's always 2 nuns standing there, and we have to talk English. Can't criticize the boarding school. It's hard to hug your mom or your dad, or your aunties or your uncles. And there's a time limit. A typical day of boarding school, there's tons and tons of prayer. The moment they switch on the light in the morning, we have to jump out of bed and get on our knees and pray. Then we have to line up to clean ourselves in the sinks. There's only 3 sinks and there's a whole room full of boys. Then we marched everywhere. Our clothes are exactly the same. And we're all given numbers. They didn't call me Hayden, they called me 67. Roll call comes, my number is 67. I have to say present. Then we march into the dining room. Before we eat, we pray. After we eat, we pray. And then we had chores after. A whole group of people went out to the barns. They cleaned the animals. They milked the cows. And some went out in the summertime, went cutting hay. And another group went to the laundry room. So they have to do the laundry for all the students in there, plus the nuns. Some went to the kitchen, peeled potatoes, and some people there went around polishing stairs. I think we only had about 3-4 hours of academic time. I spent 9 years myself in a residential school. And once you get into the boarding school, you don't see your parents until maybe Christmas time or in the summertime. The rest of the time you're in there. What went on in there was brutal. It was horrible. It was devastating. And when I left, I ran away from there. There was a damaged child. And a whole group of us were totally damaged. Physically, spiritually, mentally. It was hard. But we survived. The only thing that kept me alive was I knew who I was before I went to boarding school. I knew my language. I knew the dances. I knew the ceremonies. I knew the people. So my culture was intact. And when I went to boarding school, I just shelved my culture.
A residential school, I went for 10 years, in 1954 to 1964. And we learned to read, we learned to write, somewhat, because in my situation, we were learning from French nuns who couldn't speak English. Then they taught us to speak English in that accent. So when we left, people would ask, "Oh, you have a French accent." Many people said yes. And they got further ahead than us saying no. We're Anishinaabe. We're Ojibwe, because that was the English name, and Soto is the language that was given by the French to us. We did not have any parenting. We did not have the family around you. You never woke up in the morning and saw your mom and dad, or your kokum or your mishum. And when you went to bed, you never were able to say goodnight to your parents. I think that was the most difficult thing in our lives, and for our parents too. And just think, as a mother or as a father, and you had abuse, you had sexual, physical, all kinds of abuse at residential school, and you had to send your children. How hard would that be for anybody? I saw people being strapped, being hit, being belittled, being woken up in the middle of the night to be taken to the priest, or the nuns would wake them up and take them to the priest. And you cannot say anything. You had no control. You were helpless. Because if you ever showed any emotion, then you were strapped. So you had to stand there and watch. That is most difficult. And seeing the nuns and the priests doing that, and yet in their Bible they read that anybody that does not do well with our children, that they'll be punished. There was something wrong. Like the RCMP were the ones who come and got the kids, who threatened the parents. They say we were doing our job. But is there a time that comes when you become human? And you say, this is not right?
Children have schools in the communities, and they either go by walk-in school or bus. All the settlements have schools now in there for grade 12, from kindergarten to grade 12. Before, they used to send them all to Inuvik from all the communities. And that's where they had residential school in Laklavik. It sure have changed a lot for some people. Some, it was good for their education, and others it wasn't good. Lots of trauma and abuse and neglect, and taking away the language, the culture, the heritage, family. I remember my sisters and relatives and friends and that would go to residential school, and they come back, it's like lost. Because me, myself, I didn't go to residential school, but I went to day school. I just don't live at school, but I go home. When at day school, we can still speak our language or do things. Our older siblings always went and left us and went to go to residential schools. And me and my younger sister, we always stayed home and went on the land with our parents and hunt and do everything. By the time my sisters and brothers and relatives and that come back from residential schools, like they look lost, they didn't know what to do, how to go hunting, what to do next, or It's like they lost their identity.